Welcome to this episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. You can also find us on Brattleboro Community Television, as well as Emilie's YouTube channel. So, hey, it is 2021. I want to welcome all new and returning listeners to the first show of our third season.
Oh my goodness.
Can you believe it?
I cannot actually. I'm so glad to be doing this with you. And the third season, that's incredible.
It is. There feels something magical about that, number 3.
Yeah, so you really know a show's going to last for a while when it gets to the third season, right?
Yep, you're like, okay, It's got legs.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and it has a steady fan base. I don't know if that's true for us, but
I don't know either. But we keep showing up, which is how you get things done.
Absolutely.
And so folks who are just
in small town democracy.
That's the only way things get done is people show up. So welcome, regular contributor Emilie Kornheiser, representative for the town of Brattleboro, and newly sworn in as of Wednesday to your second biennium.
Indeed. Thank you.
Applause. I have to say, it was really sweet and touching to see the number of Windham County lawmakers who are friends with me on Facebook putting up the photo of them swearing in at their desks. Mm-hmm. It was just like, oh, democracy continues despite all the in the world. And DC.
It really does. It's very, sometimes it's so peaceful as to be a little bit boring up here, but I would take that over the other thing any day of the week.
Yes. Yeah. Which I would like to just take a moment to touch in with both of us, because even though our show is very Vermont based and the work that we do tends to be very Vermont based, Vermont, as much as it tries, is not an island. And as much as it tries, it's not a universe unto itself. And we are impacted by things that happen elsewhere in the country and the world. And so as a lawmaker who is, embarking on a new session in a pandemic, in the transition of power from one president to the next, not smooth power transition, but, how are you doing? How are you feeling? What are you thinking about right now?
What happened with the terrorist insurgency, essentially, in Washington is scary, yes. What it revealed in terms of how easily folks were able to get into the Capitol building, what that means about sort of either the complicity of Capitol Police or the level of organization and preparation that group was able to engage in without other flags being raised, red flags being raised, not Trump flags being raised. It's all really scary, and it all tells a much longer, wider story. And so I, as someone who's prone to be scared of fascism at every turn, I was expecting this. I was expecting more than this weeks ago. I think we've talked a little bit about Masha Gessen's work before, but this is what we knew was going to happen, because we've spent 4 years either looking the other way or supporting it or complicit in some way. With the rise of white supremacy all across the country and all across the world, including in Vermont. And there were Vermonters who went down on the buses.
Yeah. And
I'm curious how we're going to hold those folks accountable in their communities. And I'm curious how we're going to hold folks who haven't, spoken out yet accountable for what's happened. And so for me, at the end of the day, sort of adrenaline aside, and deep empathy for the folks who work down there and the terror they experienced, I I'm, and I don't want to sound like a broken record, Olga, but I really, this has been a year of so much being revealed to so many people.
Mm-hmm.
And as more becomes revealed, we're able to act on more and we're able to solve more problems. And at least here, rather than with COVID or, incredible health disparities with people of color, it's a discrete number of people who have died. And I mourn each of those losses, but we have so much work to do.
Yeah.
And just because, and I am very confident that Biden is going to be sworn in and we are going to have a transition of power. You can see people fleeing the ship now that things have been so firmly revealed. But the work isn't going to stop there.
Mm-hmm.
And we can't let it stop there. And we can't stop organizing and talking and really doing like real work, not just to hold people accountable in a real restorative, transformative way, but also to prevent the further rise of white supremacy, which is something that other countries have done very successfully all over the world. You can counter domestic extremism with really good progressive social and political programs. But it's work you need to be mindful of and focus on, and not just, because you have someone who's kind and patient and cares about the rule of law at the highest office, just assume everything's going to be okay. So I guess I feel like we're right in the middle of the work right now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Emily.
Mm-hmm.
The irony for me is when all this was happening in DC, I was actually working through the more than 200-page community safety review report that has just come out of the Safety Review Committee in Brattleboro, looking at how the town deploys its resources for community safety and who feels safe in the community and who does not. And as I'm working my way through this report, I get a text from a friend in London saying, "What the heck is this? This is full on dictatorship," was, I think, his text. So I was, what? And, off I go to the news sources. And I think what I've been sitting with is similar to you, Emily. But I was really sitting with, as a journalist, when I see these things unfold, even though it's not Windham County based, it's like, if I need to write something about this or impart something to the community, how am I going to make it meaningful? And how am I going to make it useful? So I was sitting with that and and this is, I don't have an answer to, but also as a journalist, feeling that part of my duty is to support people's right to assemble and their right to protest and their right to the First Amendment, regardless of whether I like what they're saying or not. And yet, what happened in the Capitol is not okay with me. And so sitting with okay, so how do I balance those two things as a professional and an individual? And I admit I don't have an answer yet. I am still sitting with them.
Well, I mean, yeah. Sorry, continue.
Oh no, but like you, I feel that what happened, I felt really frustrated with everyone saying, well, we need to call the 25th Amendment. We need to impeach him again. And my frustration was, why did it take this long to get to this point? We should have done this 4 years ago. And so I think for me, what I'm feeling is, just like the pandemic did not in many ways create new problems, it just, as you said, revealed them. And so, what Trump is not in a vacuum.
No.
And what comes next that's what we need to keep asking ourselves better questions so we can create better policy and stronger, healthier communities. And nip things in the bud sooner rather than later.
There was people there who were wearing like, the line on Twitter where everything is snarky was like, they had merch, but like there was, people wearing professionally printed sweatshirts that said like insurrection, January. I'm sorry, I have no idea what today's date is or what yesterday's date was or the date. Whatever the date was that we're talking about. I'm so embarrassing. That just happened. It really killed my story. But, like the date, and it said insurrection, and it was like, with a guy with a gun, like on the sweatshirt. Like this was not spontaneous. And I think in a lot of ways, the difference between protest and a sit-in and a rally and what terrorism is guns.
Yeah. And violence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I think, oh, sorry, go ahead, sweetie.
Yeah. I wanted to sort of talk a little bit about the resolution that we passed yesterday in the House condemning the acts, but I can wait a moment on that if you have more to say.
I think the last point I was going to make is what I found interesting too was, for me, I tend to draw a line on violence. Like it kind of stops being a protest, an assembly, or a sit-in when violence and fear are used, which is perhaps an arbitrary line for me, but it's my line. But I think the other thing that surprised me is we don't know how many Trump supporters were working in the Capitol that day. And it makes me wonder, like, how many people, despite their job, might have been to do something else, like protect the Capitol. They didn't do it.
Yeah.
And that is very uncomfortable for me. And it's probably a wussy uncomfortable, but it's an uncomfortable all the same.
No, I mean, I read a lot of science fiction. I have my whole life. And especially like future present fiction is, but
it's a good genre.
It's a great genre. But, the ideas around, when we mix that with our understanding of, how fascism rises or how coups happen, that's why I say we're sort of at the middle of the journey, because what it took to get here was a very long, deep misinformation campaign to bring all of those people along who work throughout, federal government, Vermont. We just had a state trooper who was removed from his post because he was sort of, part of this conversation, complicit in it. And it takes a long time to convince someone to sort of go against their oath of office or their obligations to justice or peace or whatever a federal employee signs up for. And so, yeah, there were so many other turning points that we could have found. And I guess I'm sad it took this long, but I'm hopeful that maybe now we are at one. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no going back.
No. I hope not.
Yes. So please take a moment to talk about the resolution that the House passed it, and has it gone on to the Senate?
It's going to the Senate today.
Okay. And it passed like 130 to 16, isn't it?
It did. Well, so yes. So it's a resolution, and usually a resolution such as this, people sign on to. And so those 113 people signed on to the resolution. Okay. A weird sort of trick of our new virtual procedure is that when we vote electronically, it's considered the equivalent of a voice vote.
Mm.
But because of the way Zoom works, if we all did a voice vote, it would take it would be 5 minutes of yeses, and the no's, it wouldn't work. Because we can't become a chorus. If you've ever tried to sing with anyone on Zoom, it's never works.
Yeah.
So it's technically a voice vote. It wasn't sort of 100 and whatever to whatever. It was, it passed is really what it is, procedurally. But yes, there were some people who did not sign on to the resolution. And I think that's really important. And it was quite explicit. Do you want me to read it? It's not very long.
I think you should.
Is that interesting? Okay.
Yeah.
Whereas on January 6th, 2021, President Donald J. Trump addressed thousands of supporters, urging them to go to the Capitol in support of his false claim that he won the 2020 presidential election. And whereas the president's supporters marched to the Capitol and violently stormed the building, attacking police officers, ransacking offices, terrorizing the members of Congress, enforcing the stoppage of the certification of President-elect Biden's electoral victory, and 4 people died as a result of the violence. And whereas the actions of this mob were not just criminal and lawless, they constitute a direct attack upon our democracy. And whereas this attack was instigated by President Donald Trump, who is attempting to overturn the results of a fair and free election that he lost in order to keep himself in power. And whereas Governor Phil Scott forcefully stated that the fabric of our democracy and the principles of our republic are under attack by the president, and called for President Trump to resign or be removed from office now, therefore be it. That the General Assembly condemns the storming of the US Capitol on January 6, 2021 as an attack on democracy, and be it further that the General Assembly calls for President Donald J. Trump to resign or be removed from office by his cabinet or by the Congress, and be it further resolved that the Secretary of State be directed to send a copy of this resolution to President Donald J. Trump, Vice President Michael Pence, and the Vermont congressional delegation.
Thank you.
Yes. And so we voted on that without debate, which I think is a really interesting thing.
Yeah. Yep.
So usually if people have strong feelings about things, they want a chance to say them. Mm-hmm. I think that's true of normal humans, but it's particularly true of politicians. And there was, and a number of Republicans signed on to this, clearly, and some didn't. And all the progressives did, and all the independents did, I believe. I haven't actually counted them. But by not debating, I think we sent a very strong message that this is just true, right? Mm-hmm. And that's very powerful. And we sent a very strong message that we don't want to hear from the voices of people who, this isn't a time to hear the voices of dissent. There's another time for that, and it's not now. And that we stand together. But I worry that it's also, quite frankly, a way of papering over or being complicit in the ways that we are complicit here in Vermont, and another opportunity for sort of Vermont exceptionalism to stand in the way of doing the work. So what we did in some ways is we allowed the folks who didn't sign on, by not having a roll call, by not debating, we allowed the folks who don't agree with this to stay in the shadows. Mm-hmm. And it's a tough thing. It's a tough thing. Like, we also didn't give them a platform.
Right.
And so I'm not saying all of that to say that I disagreed with the way we did it. I just, there are pros and cons to everything. And I think it's worth naming.
Yes.
The dynamics of what happened.
Well, and I think it's worth naming that even though this step was taken and it may have been a powerful step, it's only a step. And it can't be like, okay, we did our part, moving on. It's only a part of the work. I appreciate what you said about Vermont exceptionalism, because we're good at that. But also, I think we as humans, one of our problems is that sometimes we define ourselves by what we're not.
Yes.
And we say, well, we're not DC, so we're
Mhm.
fine.
Yes.
And it's like, well, just because we're not DC doesn't mean we're fine.
Mm-hmm.
We still have our own stuff to do and take accountability for and change. And I think I just want to name that we have to be so careful when you have such a huge flashpoint at DC right now, and such a huge example, that we don't just become complicit ourselves and be like, well, we're not that.
Yeah.
So it's fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Staying with the legislative session, mm-hmm. and moving on from that resolution, what does it feel like right now? I know there are some lawmakers who are like, we need to focus on COVID, mm-hmm. and just COVID. And some lawmakers are like, nope, let's file these bills and keep moving. What's the kind of sense in the legislature right now about next steps in regards to DC, in regards to pandemic, in regards, mm-hmm. to what Vermont just needs to get done?
Yeah. So just mechanically, which I think is really important for people to understand, that sort of the mechanics of virtual legislating are different. And so they have limitations and benefits to them. We've talked about the benefit that everyone can watch everything we do. But yesterday, for example, when we were going between joint sessions and floor sessions and trying to have committee meetings, there were just like this constant flow of different Zoom links that we all had to be navigating, with times changing. And is it the same Zoom? Like it was chaotic and confusing, and very different from you're walking into the House chamber and someone reminds you that you're supposed to be in room 11, like, because there's no one to remind you when you're like digging for the right Zoom link. And all of that, it just makes things less efficient. And democracy is not efficient to begin with.
So, which in some cases is a strength, and in some cases is just a cluster. Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Again, pluses and minuses to the inefficiency of democracy. But we are not going to be able to get done as much as we want to get done, just because of sort of the mechanics of how long things take and confusion. It takes us longer to vote on anything because we use this electronic system. It takes us a little bit longer to debate things because there's always like, can you hear me? You're still muted, So there's all of that. There's also people, we've talked about this before, people struggle to act courageously when outside of sort of social context, which is very reasonable, again, and human. And so pushing really hard legislation is probably not going to happen this year, because the conversations are sort of softer, that round the edges of that difficulty aren't available.
Mm-hmm. And when you're saying softer conversations, mm-hmm. you're meaning conversations that might happen over a cup of coffee, mm-hmm. or in the hallway of the state house,
or even just like a look between people in a public forum that helps just like someone know that someone else is with them while they're doing the hard thing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay.
And so without that sort of, and like party caucuses are a very strange beast. But what they mean for a lot of people is that you have a team that's with you, that's working on this thing. So even if you're scared or hesitant to sort of act courageously in this one way, you know that you have all these other people with you who are going to have your back if you do it. Mm-hmm. And so, but that's really, it's hard to sort of have that as a felt experience, I think, when mm-hmm. you're legislating from your, computer inside your house.
Right.
So there are those things. And there's also, Vermonters generally don't like change. And there's so much change happening so rapidly right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there's a hesitancy to jump in the mix and say, I want more change. Let's change more things right now. Right.
Right.
And so I think that a lot of us are saying like, oh, there's enough happening. We shouldn't rock the boat more. And so like one example of that is like a lot of most of the committee chairs stayed the same, even though we had a new speaker and we have a new pro tem, just as an example. So
yeah, I thought that was interesting.
That said, we can't just do COVID relief, partly because all of the committees are still meeting every day. And so they're going to do things with their time. They have stuff to do. We also can't like lose 2 years on, climate change or employment law or a whole host of things that like Vermonters need action 10 years ago on. Democracy is slow. We can't just like give up 2 years to it. We've lost so much in this last year. We can't lose momentum on every issue we care about as well.
I would also add, since COVID actually, as we have said so many times on this show, did not cause new problems. It just highlighted where we had weaknesses. We can't afford to keep those weaknesses around in case there's another fill in the blank.
So, and that's the thing. When someone says we're only going to focus on COVID relief, that means very different things to different people. Very, very different things to different people. So from my perspective, if we're only going to focus on things related to COVID, I think we could do everything on like my entire agenda, on many of my colleagues' entire agendas. But that includes like climate change legislation and, a bunch of workers' rights and employment law issues and fixing the childcare problem and family medical leave and like, those are all deeply COVID-related issues from my perspective.
So we have to go to break here in just like a minute, but I want to ask you, Emilie. So one thing that just occurred to me is now I know Tropical Storm Irene is a very different disaster than COVID. However, the conversation that former Governor Shumlin, pushed during Irene is resiliency. And building things back stronger and more resilient. And I think that did have some positive changes in some of the infrastructure that we installed after Tropical Storm Irene. But one thing I don't think I've heard, and maybe I've just missed it, is that conversation around resiliency and COVID. I haven't heard that. Is it happening and I just missed it? Or is it just not part of the conversation this time?
It's certainly not what the governor is leading with.
Okay. That's kind of where I was going.
Yeah. And maybe when we come back from the break, we can talk about sort of the remarks, the State of the State address, and then the responses from the House and Senate about that.
Fantastic. That's what we shall do. Stay tuned, everyone. The Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro will return in a moment. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. You can also find us on Brattleboro Community Television and our new Montpelier Happy Hour Facebook page and the montpelierhappyhour.captivate.fm webpage. You can check us out in both places.
Congratulations on doing the work on that, Olga.
Why, thank you. And thank you for your patience while I figured out.
No patience required.
The new world. Well, thank you, darling. So let's touch base on the State of the State address, because I think with everything happening in DC, a lot of it's just gone by. A lot of Vermonters' bandwidth just kind of flew right past it. So for you, what were some of the key takeaways?
I should have known you were going to ask me that.
Do you want me to ask you a different question?
No, it's fine. So there was a lot of talk, as we've sort of already touched on, about moderation and unity. And as we've discussed many other times on the show, there are different ways to compromise and seek unity. And one of them is watering everything down.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the flavor of this speech from my perspective. It was very calming, which I think, is probably the appropriate tone for that a lot of people are seeking right now.
Especially from a governor.
And a lot of gratitude for frontline workers, National Guard and teachers, and a lot of really, some of the raw exceptionalism that we do deserve around how we come together to take care of neighbors, and how we have been, all things considered, very responsive to mandates and, social distancing and all of that. It is not very rich in content, the remarks, but some threads I can pull. And if anyone is seeking to follow it, I highly recommend the governor's Twitter feed or Jane Lindholm's Twitter feed, because you can just sort of scan through all the remarks fairly quickly, and they're in little bite-size, maybe to match the teleprompters, bite-size pieces. So sometimes for me, that's a little better for my brain than watching someone talk in a slow, steady way. So there are threads around the economy and how it can reach more corners of our state, how a robust economy can reach more corners of our state. But it's not clear how or for whom.
Okay.
So again, is this about increasing wages for people in those corners of the state? That certainly wasn't highlighted. There was more language about businesses and the economy than there was about people and how they experience the economy.
Right. Which has been a theme, I think, of the governors.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. So again, we are not using the phrase trickle down explicitly because we know that we're not supposed to use that anymore, but the ideas are still strong in there. Still strong in there.
The pig has a new form of lipstick. Is that what you're saying? The new shade of lipstick?
No, I think we just haven't even. It's like more that we're pretending it's not a pig anymore. Is that what I don't know what the lipstick thing means, Olga. I can't work with that one.
It means you're trying to gussy up something that really shouldn't be gussied up.
No, I think it's more than that. I think it's more that you're like using soy-based bacon but pretending it's bacon, or I don't know. I'm gonna fail no matter what I try to say next. So
moving on.
Yeah, thank you. So there's a lot of sort of like lowering costs for businesses so that they can thrive, and not a lot about, so that they can pay living wages or, hire more people or anything like that. And then some conversation about education. And so again, starting off with this theme that I really agree with, that like we've realized how important our schools are for families and kids, and how important that is and how much we value it. And then pivoting to what I think is sort of a hint around some more testing, but it's not really quite clear to me. There's stuff about sort of like literacy standards and the cost of education. Being
a perennial topic in Vermont, yes.
Yes. And then early childhood being very important, and a push to actually bring that in under the Agency of Education. Early care and education has, for folks who don't know where every piece of their bureaucracy is, early care and education has always sat in the Department of Children and Families in the Child Development Division. Right. And since pre-K was implemented, some of the funding for some of that sits in the Agency of Education. And so it's become a collaboration between the Agency of Education and the Child Development Division. but he's very much saying that he's going to request that child development moves entirely into the Agency of Education. And on the face of it, that makes a lot of sense. But the way each of those agencies work is very differently.
Right.
And the Child Development Division, the way they do their work, it's a regulatory division.
Oh, right. Good point.
And the Agency of Education is not regulatory. It could probably stand to do a bit more of that. But they really are essentially moving money and reports is the bulk of what they do. They do very little technical assistance for districts. Districts are left to do that on their own. And they tend to not regulate or enforce. And so it would be a big shift to either bring regulation and enforcement to the Agency of Education, who is not really familiar with that, which might have some benefits, I don't know, or be really sort of releasing the Child Development Division from that regulation and enforcement, which would have huge implications for the quality of early care and education. So that's interesting. And then there's an inspiring story about Spanish flu, and then we're done.
Okay. You know, one thing that has struck me often when we talk about some of these big issues facing Vermont and different lawmakers, including the governor's approach to them. And I was, again, going back to DC and Trump's video tweets about, oh, you're so special and you're right, but go home and be, like having his cake and eating it too. I've been thinking about language, and what I find so fascinating about some of the language that has been moving through the State House over recent years is it's like big words that a lot of concepts can be put into, but there's no definition.
Yeah.
Like affordability. We've talked about this before.
So much, yes.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, you say, yeah, we need to make Vermont affordable. And most people go, yes, we do. But the how and what affordable means and what it means for who, widely distant definitions, I think, at times.
And the governor's state of the state has always, in my limited experience, been a mix of those very broad, vague concepts, and then these like little mines, a very small nibble around the edges. I remember having this exact conversation with you last year. Right. These very small nibble around the edges proposals that are named very explicitly in the state of the state. Like he named mini TIFs. Do you know what a mini TIF is, Olga?
I do, but we should explain it for listeners.
I'm not going to. We can talk about it some other time, but like it's certainly not so important a concept that it deserves to be in the state of the state. That's all I want to say. It's
an economic development contest,
and like
basically.
A very small tool in the toolbox that often doesn't work very well at all. So it's just funny, like these little nibble around the edges minds that are very explicit, but are not really connected. They're certainly not going to solve or remedy or create change around these huge concepts that are sort of floated through the speech. And so he can say, I care about affordability in the economy, and I'm going to do mini TIFs. And then when we don't do mini TIFs, he'll say, the Democrats, they don't care about the economy and affordability, but like it's not, they're not robust theories of change, I guess is all I'm going to say.
So I have a kind of a dumb question to ask.
I doubt that.
Well, I'm feeling I should know the answer and I just don't. So here's my question. So prior to the legislative session starting, does the governor, Scott, Shumlin, whomever, it happens to be governor, and whomever happens to be House and Senate leadership, do they all get together and say, okay, here are what we think Vermont needs. Here are some of the things we care about. Let's all get on the same page so we're rowing the boat together. Or at least we know where we're not rowing the boat together. Like, do they have any kind of meeting to kind of...
I think that would probably be a better question to ask of either Senate or House leadership, maybe next time they come on the show. But My understanding is it's very different from different administrations.
Gotcha.
And the Scott administration has been fairly famous for the way they don't participate in those conversations and will wait until the very last minute to say no. That's not of interest to us. Including, you'll ask members of the administration who you're involved in active problem solving with, agency heads, et cetera, questions. And they'll say, I can't answer that until the governor's budget comes out, And so we spend weeks working on things that we, would have certainly been better with further content and context. And so that's there's a lot of sort of political gamesmanship involved in that lack of transparent communication. Can you hear those dings when they happen?
No.
Great. Okay.
That's good. That means you can't hear my heating system popping.
No, but this is internal to my computer, so it must be somehow isolated from you. It's great.
Yay!
So no, we have our own agenda, and I think we actually broadcast our agenda fairly broadly and transparently. And certainly when the speaker and the pro tem spoke last night, I watched on WCAX. I think there's probably a lot of other opportunities to listen or hear it. They were very transparent about sort of where the priorities are. That's, childcare and broadband and other aspects of recovery from there. But in terms of sort of the really big lifts, that will be where it is.
Okay. So how about committees? Because usually that's where a lot of the actual work on bills happen is committees. And I went through and I just looked for Windham County, and it doesn't look like a lot of changes. Carolyn Partridge is still the chair of Ag and Forest. We have some new members, such as Michelle Boslin, who was put on corrections and institutions, and Leslie Goldman, who is added to healthcare. But I don't.
There's actually
vice chair. You're vice chair of Ways and Means.
I am vice chair of Ways and Means, Olga. Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So that's quite exciting, and a big change. We have not, and Tristan Tolino was assigned to appropriations.
Okay, that's new.
And that is new. And so Vermont actually has not, until I was moved to Ways and Means mid-pandemic in the spring, Windham County had not actually had someone on a money committee for quite a while. And so now we have the two of us, me as vice chair on Ways and Means and Tristan on appropriations, which is fantastic. We also, Sarah Coffey is vice chair of Corrections and Institutions, which has its own budget attached to it, and is going to do a lot on criminal justice reform, and on clean water, which are two things that Windham County cares very much about. And then having someone from Windham County on healthcare is really huge and important. Leslie's a great person to be there. She has, been working in the healthcare field her entire career, and in a number of different roles. And so between the retreat and sort of ongoing conversations around the BMH network and what that means, I think it's going to be really important that we have someone and someone knowledgeable and capable on healthcare. And so those are all really exciting pieces. And then
Laura Sibilia on energy and tech is important too, because they do the broadband.
They do the broadband, yeah. And that's something that Laura's been leading on, and something really important to, we have this really sort of front of the pack communications union district in our region, partly because of the work of Laura. And then Rep. John Gannon, who's also a Windham County rep, is staying as vice chair of GovOps and is really leading the charge on redistricting, which is something that's going to have a huge impact on Windham County.
Okay.
Because we've had such population shifts in the last 10 years. And so that's going to make a big difference. And I'm really grateful that we have a Windham County rep on that too.
We have two.
Yes.
Mike Maricki's there as well.
And Mike Maricki's there as well. So yeah, it's been And Molly is still on transportation, bless her heart. I don't even think I could do it for 2 years, and she loves it. And it's incredible, to have someone from Windham County on that too. Like the Route 9 corridor is very contentious. It's really important that we have her there. And then she's been like beating this drum, and for years, very much in isolation about alternative transportation.
Yeah.
And she finally, has enough colleagues that she's able to see some movement on that. And that's going to be really powerful when I think about COVID recovery, and when I was sort of earlier talking about, I can see a nexus between COVID and so many issues. Transportation changes are a huge one of those, right? Like there are a lot of people who are now working from home much more and might into the future. What does that mean for how many vehicles they need? I know at my house, we have 2 vehicles, we have 3 drivers. And before this, I was like, oh my God, do we need a 3rd vehicle? That's disgusting. But now I actually have to go out of my way to remember to alternate vehicles I'm driving to make sure that they get started regularly. So I think there's a lot of things about that, how we think about Medicaid rides and school busing, and sort of both health and safety related to that, but also how we can better integrate those systems so that folks who live in rural areas are able to get places without a vehicle. I think that's really huge as our population ages even more.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of fun action. I hope now I'm scared that I missed someone.
Kelly Pajala, we didn't mention
Payala.
that she's on Payala, sorry.
It's okay. I'm not Kelly. Don't apologize to me. And Kelly being on Human Services, and she's one of the members that's been on that committee for a long time. They are leading the charge on childcare. She's been really involved with that. She's on the after school working group, which is really tasked to find a solution to the after school challenges and funding challenges for that in our state. And so she's going to do some great work on that, and is able to do it from the perspective of someone who lives sort of outside of the regular metro areas.
Yeah.
And so I'm confident that she's going to be advocating for solutions that meet the needs of everyone in Windham County, not just Brattleboro folks. So that's really great.
Yeah, if folks aren't aware of some of the childcare legislation that Vermont has worked on in recent years, it's worth a look if you feel like being geeky, because one thing that's always impressed me about that big childcare bill that came out last session.
Did we do a show on that?
We did. And I will try to find it and put it on our Facebook page as a reminder. But one thing that's always impressed me about that bill is it focused on childcare, but focused in all the ways that what intersected with childcare.
Yeah.
And I just thought that this is kind of a great way. I hope we see more bills like this.
And we're going to do that again this biennium.
Yay.
Yeah. So that's really exciting.
Yeah.
And then, Michelle being on corrections and institutions, she was put there because her background is in, her work life is in restorative justice. She worked at the Brattleboro Restorative Justice Center. And so having someone with some on the ground experience of re-entry is going to be really huge there.
Right. That's a great point. Thank you.
So,
sorry. Go ahead.
This is one of the ways that we talk a lot about how the committees create silos in systems.
Yeah.
And one of them is that our restorative justice system in Vermont on the ground is often quite integrated between pretrial and release. It's the same people who are sort of working on those issues. Right. But in the legislature, that's divided between judiciary and corrections institutions.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And so I'm really excited that we have sort of people with expertise on both of those committees on these, who have worked in those systems. And so that's really exciting.
That is very exciting. Thank you for bringing that up.
And I know that that's a huge theme in the report from the Brattleboro's Community Safety Committee.
Yeah, which is also on the brattleboro.org website, right on the homepage in the right-hand sidebar. And I recommend people check it out because it's a really well-written, very in-depth report that makes connections between different parts of the community that I think traditionally have been siloed. and people's experience of them that are really, really important and key. Fantastic. Any other thoughts on committees? I mean, how about for you as a vice chair? How are you seeing your committee life change? What are you excited about? I see your face lighting up.
I am lighting up because I really have no idea. I'm very excited. I am, as probably anyone who's ever watched the show or met me, I'm a very high context person. I like as much information about any situation as I can possibly get. And so being vice chair means that I will, be able to be part of conversations that I wasn't a part of before. And so that will be wonderful. I'm, it's really interesting to think about tax policy in the context of the pandemic and pandemic recovery.
Yeah.
Because as we know, it's further exacerbated the rich getting rich and the poor getting poor. In terms of, it's really split the middle class in a way that wasn't quite split before.
Yep.
And we've talked about this sort of K-shaped recovery before. And so that's really interesting to think about. And that we're moving sort of more towards individuals with wealth and, while we have a lot of businesses that are struggling, and that's sort of another interesting twist as well. So that will all be, that's going to be fun. I'm excited for the new opportunity. It also is just a really heartening honor. I often feel like such a troublemaker. That people asking too many questions, sharing my perspective too often. And so to have that show of confidence from both my chair and from House leadership is really heartening in terms of what is possible in Vermont politics.
Yes. I think for your birthday, I'm going to give you a t-shirt that says "Good Troublemaker."
Aw, thanks. It's in October, so we're going to have to wait a while.
Oh, we will. That's right.
Yeah.
Oh, well. You have something to look forward to now.
I do. I didn't until this moment, but now I have something to look forward to.
Looking ahead for the next coming weeks, I know a lot of things are in play in the State House. Anything listeners should be paying attention to?
The first thing that's going to be moving, and like really much faster than we usually have a bill moving, is a bill about town meeting.
Oh, yes.
Which is does not change anything for Brattleboro at all. And so if people catch wind of it and get concerned, Brattleboro essentially has a carve out because of our strange and special town meeting situation.
That happens later in the month.
That happens later. It's actually not that it happens later that makes us so special. It's that we know who's going to attend.
Yep.
So in having conversations about town meeting and moving town meeting to a virtual format, it didn't feel possible and just to be moving it virtually for communities who couldn't do explicit outreach to every single person, and the level of technical assistance that Brattleboro engaged in to make sure that every town meeting member had a place to connect and a way to connect and understood how the technology worked.
Right.
So in other communities, town meeting is something you wander into. Rather than some people are sort of explicitly expected to go there. And so because of that, this legislation enables Australian ballot for communities that have not done that before for their town meeting provisions or to push town meeting. Communities have a choice of that, but they don't have a choice of going virtual, whereas Brattleboro is still able to do that.
Gotcha. Okay.
And we already do Australian ballot for a bunch of our on town meeting day. We have Australian ballot voting, and so that's going to stay the same way it always is, though I imagine we'll be able to mail those ballots. I have not checked with our town clerk about that yet. We were not mailing those ballots.
At the last select board meeting, Hillary Francis, Brattleboro's town clerk, recommended that they keep to the traditional system of, if you want a ballot you need mailed to you, you need to request it.
Oh, okay.
And the select board agreed with that. So yes, if you're in Brattleboro and you want your ballot mailed to you, request it.
Okay, so nothing has
request
changed.
It for the whole year. Yeah.
And is the town clerk's office going to be open? Are they open now? I know they didn't used to be open before.
Oh, so if you want to vote in person at the town clerk's office, you mean?
Mm-hmm.
That, I'm going to say probably not. She did say something about that, but I don't remember what it was. But I think it was probably not.
Okay.
So you'd either have to get a ballot and mail it back,
Mm-hmm.
mailed to you, or vote on voting day at the polls.
Or my guess, and maybe we should do some more research and talk about this more. You could make an appointment to pick up a ballot and then drop it in the drop box.
That is probably, I will double check that because I actually think I have to write an article about it.
Oh, well, once you
so-
learn about this for your article, listeners are welcome to go read Olga's article, or maybe we can just sort of do a quick check-in about this next week.
Yep.
So anyway, that's the legislation that's going to be moving the fastest because it's sort of necessary. And then there were a few deadlines or sunsets that we put in COVID legislation because we thought it was going to end sooner or something. So there's some workers' comp legislation that I think we've talked about before on the show that has a sunset of January 15th. That's going to need some quick action. Some issues around unemployment insurance and how much employers pay is going to have some quick action. And I'm sure a few other things that I do not know about.
Okay.
And
Fantastic.
then, you know, the other thing that I'm so sorry I didn't start with or lead with is the Biden administration. And actually pre-Biden administration, there is money that is coming here, that has come here. So figuring out how to spend that is going to be a pretty key chunk of time and effort. And unemployment insurance, the extra $300 that was in that bill has already started being paid out for folks.
Great.
And the other piece of that is even more important, I don't know if it's more important, it's equally important, is that folks who maxed out their benefits, there was a lot of people who maxed out their benefits at the end of December, actually.
Yeah.
That has been extended.
Okay.
And so both of those things are very exciting.
Yeah, very fantastic. Okay.
Yeah. And so once again, public service announcement, if you're having trouble with the unemployment insurance system and you need help, please feel free to get in touch. Yes. I do not make magic, but sometimes I can raise a flag.
Yeah. A word to all, even if you're not getting in touch with Emily and you're getting in touch with another lawmaker, don't wait. Do it sooner rather than later if you're struggling. Because the sooner you can kind of disrupt the struggle, the better.
Yes.
So we unfortunately are out of time. This hour just went by so fast. It's so fun to reconnect.
Oh my goodness, it has.
It really has.
It's so good to talk to you, Olga.
So quickly, do you have a toast for our listeners? Or I can toast.
To a new year with new ideas and new solutions and a fresh look at democracy.
I love it. Hear, hear. And napkins.
Napkins to napkins.
Well, everybody here on the Montpelier Happy Hours show, you can find us at 2 p.m. on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. You can also, on Fridays, you can also find us at the Montpelier Happy Hour.captivate.fm, as well as our Montpelier Happy Hour Facebook page. Emily, if people have questions for you.
You can call me, email me, text me, come to my weekly community conversations every Saturday at 10 a.m. via Zoom. And how to do any of those things you can find at my website, emilykornheiser.org.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.